On the afternoon of April 4th, 1922, Lawrence Schlittenbauer sat at his house concerned. His two sons were due back any minute with important news. Mainly, where were the Grubers? Eventually, the boys returned, but with an even more mystifying report, only corroborating the rumors and stories of strange events happening over at the Hinterkaifeck farm. Finally, he decided the time had come for him to see what was going on for himself. On his way to the neighboring property, Lawrence would be joined by Michael Hull and Jakob Siegel, two farmers that lived close by. The trio would make it to the Hinterkaifeck farm around 3:30 p.m. A door leading off the barn was left wide open, so the men made their way to the barn door. This they found locked. Fear began to spike through Lawrence as they decided to bash the door down to get inside. The scene that met their eyes was as gruesome as it was horrific. Lawrence immediately began a search for the youngest member of the Gruber family, Joseph, ignoring the protests from his companions, disturbing the scene in his frantic search and moving things until he at last found what he was looking for. Lawrence's actions on that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hello and welcome back to Lauren's Legends. Right out of the gate, I need to give a disclaimer. This story is sad, it's gruesome, and not for the faint of heart. You have been warned because today we're diving into the spooky, unsolved 1922 heinous homicides in Bavaria, Germany. Possibly the most famous unsolved German case out there that has now become known as the Hinterkaifeck murders. Now, I would also like to throw out another disclaimer that this case is over 100 years old, meaning that much of the research is to be taken with a grain of salt. Police procedures in rural Bavaria may not have been as thorough as the guys on Criminal Minds back in those days. Thus, details have gotten confused, reports vary, and some of them contradict one another, and theories abound as to just what happened that fateful night in March those long years ago. With this one, you will need to wait until the end to see who I think the perpetrator is. I would turn a light on, and if you learn anything from this video, it is to always check on those sounds that old houses make. It may not just be the house. Before getting into the case, we need to dive into the background. Let's take it all the way back to 1885 when Cäcilia Gruber's first husband dies and the Hinterkaifeck property passes to her. Not long after, she marries one of the farmhands at the Hinterkaifeck, Andreas Gruber. Looking at this union logically, as Andreas was 12 years Cäcilia's junior, it seemed they both were benefiting from the marriage. Andreas gets a family and all the shared wealth the farm could bring, while Cäcilia gets someone to work the farm. Perhaps it wasn't so crass as all that, and the flame of love burned bright in the beginning. However, as the years wove on, some reports have claimed that people in the village thought Andreas was quite disagreeable. Rumors of unjustifiable anger, horrible treatment of his family, and even people being run off the farm by a scythe-wielding madman. Again, it's tough to know if all or any of that is true, but suffice it to say, Andreas was not beloved by his neighbors. Alternatively, Hinterkaifeck was actually a successful farm, and the Grubers were well off. This, in turn, of course, will always spark jealousy, meaning perhaps some of the more slanderous tales about Andreas might be somewhat over-exaggerated. However, what cannot be exaggerated is that two of their children would pass away very young. Again, some claiming mistreatment. A third daughter, Victoria, would survive to adulthood and lived at Hinterkaifeck her entire life. Jumping forward to 1899, a certain Lawrence Schlittenbauer would move to a neighboring farm in Groburn, not 500 meters away from Hinterkaifeck. Over the next couple of years, Lawrence would become the local leader of Groburn and would, of course, hear all of the nasty rumors circulating about Andreas Gruber. One such rumor seemed to have merit, as Lawrence would reveal in an interrogation in 1931. At 16 years old, this being 1903, Victoria Gruber supposedly told Lawrence's wife at the time, also named Victoria, that her father had used her in the biblical way. Nothing would come of these rumors apart from no one seeming to care much for Andreas until a few years later. Things progressed much as they might at any other farmstead in the early 1900s, and young Victoria would meet Carl Gabriel in 1914. Although the exact time is a mystery, somewhere around the same moment, Victoria would be passed ownership of the Hinterkaifeck and would marry Gabriel in April. Unfortunately, 8 months later, it would be reported that Carl had been killed in France fighting in World War I. Not even a month after that, Cäcilia Gabriel was born. They, and we, will call her Celie to avoid confusion with her grandmother. Now, on May 28th of 1915, Andreas and Victoria were both tried and convicted for keeping it in the family. It's a word that starts with N and ends in est. I think you understand. Oddly enough, the crimes in question took place over a period of 3 years, from 1907 to 1910. It is unknown who lodged the complaint and charges that led to these convictions, but Andreas would spend an entire year in jail, and Victoria herself would spend a whole month. Can you believe that back in the day, when a young woman was being treated like this by her father, they could still put her in jail for participating, even if she may have not had a choice? Did one of the workers at the farm make something up? Likely not. I think one would assume that based on the many rumors and the fact that this was apparently a common occurrence, it is believable. In fact, in 1919, Josef Gabriel would be born. Or would it be Josef Gruber or Josef Schlittenbauer? Obviously, it wasn't her deceased husband who fathered the child, but interestingly, Lawrence Schlittenbauer's wife would pass away on July 14th, 1918. He would later claim that Victoria Gruber came on to him just 2 weeks after his wife's death, apparently forcing herself upon him, to use his exact words. So about this time, you can probably see where this is going. Victoria becomes pregnant. According to his interrogation, Lawrence claimed he had only had relations about 5 times with Victoria, but he still wanted to marry her. Apparently, Daddy Andreas refused to allow the union. Ugh, so creepy. It seems little Josef's paternity is now in question, so what would happen next? Lawrence testifies against Andreas, claiming more familial relations, and Andreas is arrested again and put in holding. Varying reports would state that Lawrence didn't want the child because he didn't want to pay child support, but those reports would also say that Lawrence was desperate to find his son on that fateful day in 1922. After roughly a week in jail for Andreas, Victoria convinced Lawrence to accept the paternity of Josef and recant his statements about Andreas, even though this did very little to confirm who in fact had fathered Josef. Lawrence would go on to marry again a couple of years later. supposedly wanting to put Victoria behind him. September of 1921 rolled around and Kessens Rieger, longtime maid at Hinterkaifeck, had had enough. She cited hearing strange noises coming from the attic and different occurrences she couldn't explain as her reasons for leaving. Believing the farm was haunted by evil spirits, she would abruptly quit. Speculation, of course, abounds that she trumped those stories up, and the real reason she quit was because she walked in on Andreas and Victoria doing something they really should have stopped doing by now. This was, of course, never confirmed, but Kessens did well by herself by leaving when she did. It was a choice that would save her life in the end. In March of 1922, it would turn out to be the worst of times for Hinterkaifeck. Andreas would report sometime in the middle of the month that a newspaper from Munich randomly showed up. He asked the mailman, and no one in the vicinity even subscribed to the said paper. Stranger still was that he reported hearing footsteps in the attic around this time. A key to the farmhouse also mysteriously vanished that same week. Furthermore, Hinterkaifeck had an attached engine house that didn't actually connect to the rest of the house, but the lock on it had clearly been broken. A further attempt at breaking into the feed room was obvious based on Andreas's examination. He would also report finding fresh tracks in the snow leading up to the house, but there was none leading away. So whoever had walked in had not left. Groomer would run into Lawrence on March 30th, 1922 and relate the story, as well as telling the farmer Casper Stigmar from Groburn, whom he met the same day. The next morning at school, little Celie Gruber could barely stay awake in class, and when the teacher asked her why, she would describe a disturbing event late the night before between her mother and her grandparents. Apparently, their argument was so ferocious that Victoria would run off alone into the woods, not to be found for hours. Eventually, she was, and it is said that she was crying her eyes out by the Par River nearby. A peaceable solution must have been found because, according to Sophie Fuchs, a classmate of Celie's, who had given an interview in 1951, Victoria had returned home safely. Again, this was a 30-year-old memory of a story told by a small child to another small child, so while this has been reported many times and seems to be an agreed upon part of the story, let's also take this one with a grain of salt. Regardless, it doesn't paint the best of pictures as to the scenario dawning at the Hinterkaifeck on March 31st, 1922. That morning would be when Andreas and Victoria were seen in town and are said to have discussed the strange goings-ons at the farm with their neighbors in the nearby Schrobenhausen. Both would report that a cow had been untied in the night and was running loose in the barn, as well as odd noises again coming from the attic. These stories were once again reported some years later, drawn out of the memories of witnesses and never actually documented. The duo would return to the farm about 4:30 in the afternoon because they were going to meet their new nanny. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, would arrive to Hinterkaifeck with her sister Franziska Schaefer. This was Maria's first day, and she was excited to start and show her sister where she would be working. Schaefer would stay for roughly an hour before leaving. When Franziska left, she had high hopes for her sister, but little did she know that would be the last time she would ever see her sister alive. Many would agree that Franziska would be the last to see them all alive. What transpired at some point over the next few hours still eludes closure, still remains a mystery to this day, a horror the likes of which Germany has not seen again and hopefully never will. The next morning, April 1st, comes as it does, and little Celie is missing from school. Additionally, coffee salesmen Hans and Edward Shavosky travel out to Hinterkaifeck sometime in the morning to get the Gruber's order for the month, something they had been doing for some time. The place seemed deserted, the animals restless. After a few knocks at the door and a look around the place, they would wait a bit, then leave, assuming the Grubers had forgotten the salesman would be visiting and were just not home. A local carpenter by the name of Michael Plockel would pass by the farm later that evening and reported being approached by a man with a bright lantern. A horrid stench emanated from the chimney, but Plockel would be far more concerned with the person attempting to blind him with the lantern. He would leave the scene without ever discerning who was behind the lantern's brilliant glow. Just a few hours later, as would be reported by the local butcher, Simon Reiblander says he saw two men on the edge of the woods who turned their faces from him so he was unable to identify them. He later supposed these two could have been involved somehow. Whoever they were, again, more speculation and rumors. Sunday would bring even more mystery as the usual regular attendance of the Grubers at church is interrupted, which didn't escape notice in the small community. Later that day, the son of the butcher relates that he went out to buy lard from the Grubers to find the place quiet and seemingly deserted as well. Monday, April 3rd, the postman, Josef Mayer, would post the paper to the window like he always did. He looked through the kitchen window like he always did. He was hoping for a glimpse of cute little Josef rocking in a stroller like he always did. Speaking in an interview in 1952, Mayer was adamant that it felt out of place that neither the stroller nor Josef were anywhere to be found in the kitchen. We finally reached the most fateful day of all, April 4th, 1922. A scheduled repair on the tractor was set for 9 a.m. and sure enough, the mechanic Albert Hofner showed up to complete the grueling task. His story is well documented, as it's also known he had spoken with the mayor of nearby Wengen 30 minutes prior to making it out to Hinterkaifeck. The normal route to the machine room was blocked, so he went around back to find that the door was locked as well. A peek through the kitchen window revealed nothing other than the sound of cows milling about in the next door barn, and the dog was barking its head off from somewhere inside the house. With a shrug of indifference, he led his way over to an apple tree by the garden gate where he would sit down and wait for an hour. He said that he whistled to ensure that if anyone came up on him or on the property, they would immediately be aware of his presence. Eventually, he could wait no longer. I imagine that he had other appointments to keep that day, so he went through the door on the north side of the property into the engine room. 4.5 long hours of greasy hard labor later, and Hofner fired up the diesel engine. He wanted to make sure it worked, but he also was purposely being as loud as possible so anyone would know he was there. He would lock the door to the engine room and go back through the garden to the courtyard. Here is where things get really suspicious. He says the barn door was wide open and he came within 3 feet of it without actually looking in. Why he didn't look in the barn? Who knows? He would then move along the side of the house to the front door where the dog was somehow now outside, still barking its head off, but the front door remained locked. Not knowing what to make of this, Hoffner would move back through the garden for his bike on the north side of the property, and then he would make his way to Groburn, where he would relate to Lawrence's daughters, Victoria and Maria, coincidentally, that the engine was in working order, but the farm was devoid of any human life. Little did Albert Hoffner know, he had just spent all morning at a brutal crime scene, and 4.5 hours he had been working on an engine with only a door between him and 4 bodies. Of course, after Hoffner left, Lorenz's daughters would relate his update to their father, who in turn sent his sons Johann and Josef to investigate. The teenagers would return and report to their father the same thing that all the others had. The place seemed deserted. The time had come for Lorenz to go and see Hinterkaifeck for himself. I imagine that he was worried about what he might find, given all of the strange things that had been happening. It makes sense that he picked up Jakob Siegel and Michael Pohl on his way over there. The horrific scene they found in the barn after breaking the door down was the bodies of Andros, Cäcilia Gruber, Victoria, and poor little Celie sprayed out amongst the hay with a door laying on top of Andreas. I guess that people didn't know not to mess with a crime scene back then, because Lorenz immediately pulled the heavy door off Andreas and propped little Celie up against the wall. The others he left alone. I suppose his companions were mortified at this point and didn't try to stop him. When later asked why he did this, he would claim that he was looking for his son. Upon not finding Josef in the haystack, he then produced a key, presumably the missing key that Andreas had reported the week before. Lorenz would go around to the back kitchen door, which needed the key to lock or unlock it from the inside to let the others in. He would then resume his search, finding poor Maria Baumgartner deceased in her new room. She had not even had time to unpack. And there in Victoria's room was little Josef in his bassinet. It is unknown how long Lorenz lingered before sending someone to call for the police, but they would not arrive until 6 o'clock, meaning that there was roughly 2 hours where it was open season at this crime scene. Any Tom, Dick, or Harry could wander in, and reportedly they did. Eventually, a higher authority arrived from Schrobenhausen and cordoned off the area. The real investigators from Munich would not arrive until the following morning. However, of course, interrogations ensue. Mainly Lorenz and his 2 chums, as well as Maria's sister Franziska. George Reingruber was the lead detective, and what was immediately obvious was that someone had been staying and or living there for a period of time before and after the slayings. There was evidence that the entire supply of bread had been eaten and some of the meat had been cut as well. It also appeared as if the animals had been fed and the fire had been tended to. They would find hay strewn about in the attic as if someone was trying to muffle footsteps, as well as a couple of boards cut out of the floor to presumably spy on those below. Further still, there was a rope tied to the rafters for a quick exit to the ground. So that makes it seem like someone was staying there before the night of March 31st. Then wow. Who would stick around the scene like that after committing such a brutal act? That's so creepy. So again, I'll have to brush up on my CSI Miami, but the reports indicate that the autopsies that took place were done on a table in the courtyard. As official and sanitary as that sounds, here is what they found. Cecilia Gruber had 8 holes in her head where she had been bashed to her ending. Now, the holes would be the identifier of the weapon. Andreas had a custom mattock that he screwed a clamp to and left this screw unthreaded some of the way. This meant that it protruded off the back of the axe head. He designed it for use on animals. That thought is brutal on its own, and I do not condone it. This mattock would be found later in a hidden compartment in the attic. Victoria would likewise be found with a similar number of holes from the implement where she too had been beaten to her end. Some reports also claim that Victoria had strangulation marks, but other reports fail to mention this. Little Celie's wounds were a bit different, and this part just really breaks my heart to think about. This little girl had only one obvious blow from the mattock, but her jaw had been smashed with something else and her throat had been cut with a small knife. Celie had been moved to a sitting position against the wall by Lawrence when he had first found the 4. Celie was found missing some of her clothes, as well as holding lumps of what was assumed to be her own hair. Investigators concluded that Celie was the last to pass away and must have survived the initial onslaught. Perhaps she had laid there in a daze, not knowing what to do, staring at her family members that had passed, and began pulling her own hair out. There is an actual disorder called trichotillomania, or TTM. It is a disorder where when someone is going through extreme distress, they have an uncontrollable urge to pull out their hair. I just cannot even begin to imagine the hours that this little human endured laying there with the others around her, pulling out her own hair until she passed away. It is just awful. Andreas would have far different wounds than the others. They would find that Andreas had seemingly fallen onto the pickaxe. They found the pickaxe in the food trough, and the wounds to his face indicated that someone had sunk the pickaxe into his eye and then ripped it out the side of his cheek, exposing the bone. Ugh. Corroborating the mattocks as the weapon was the fact that they found the dog tied up in the barn as well, with a clear bruise on his eye and a small indentation like those of the victims. Thankfully, the poor pup was alive, but it would not go anywhere near anyone who arrived to investigate and would eventually be rehomed with relatives. Now, the mystifying part about the scene was the way in which everyone was found. They were piled in the haystack all together, but there were no obvious signs of them being dragged or placed there. This is where the theories start flying off the rails. The police decided that the perpetrator lured them into the barn one by one. It was concluded through experiments that screams from the barn could not be heard in the main area of the house. And so one by one, the victims came through the door from the narrow hallway and were surprise attacked 4 times in a row. There were red splatters on the door, lending support to this theory. This is the one detail in this whole tragedy that I just cannot wrap my head around. Some theories would hold that there was more than one killer, which might have made it easier to lure them in, but I just don't know. 2 people staying up in the attic doesn't make sense. It just seems like way too specific of a set of circumstances to happen in succession. The police claim that the unalivings took place sometime between 7 p.m. and midnight. Andreas being found in his night clothes was one indication of this, as well as the fact that the calendar had already been turned to April 1st. Yes, maybe the person who stayed behind could have done that, but also it was probably just a habitual thing to turn the calendar at night before bed. It still seems too perfect to me that they somehow only went to the barn one by one. The investigation followed the supposed timeline to Maria's room, who was found with at least one hole at the top of her head and multiple contusions to the face and right side of her skull. Maria was found covered by a blanket as well. Presumably, the monster or monsters did this before moving on to little baby Joseph. Joseph would be found with a single blow to the head, which went through the top of the bassinet. The frame of the stroller was bent down where his head was. It's not clear why this had to happen. Maybe the baby was crying too much and the person didn't want to deal with that. Just, it seems so unnecessary. A couple of things to know are that even though fingerprinting had come around in 1909, they did not take any at Hinterkaifeck. Maybe they just assumed that so many people had been around it that it was probably no use anyway. They at first assumed the motive to be robbery, but would find a huge chest of coins, some other valuables, and a few things worth some real loot, none of which had been gone through or tampered with in any way. Also, after the autopsies, they would remove the heads and send them to Munich for a further inspection. This part has come under some skepticism from various reports. It appears that the victims were buried without ever having their heads returned to their bodies. The funeral was held on April 8th, and one account has it that so many people from the town showed up that the church was unable to seat them all. Apparently, they had more goodwill with their neighbors than many reports would have us believe. Or this was just so shocking for the community. So a couple of months pass and the police are still investigating, but the question of who inherits the farmstead at Hinterkaifeck is up in the air. Andreas' brother had been staying there since the deaths, which I find very creepy on its own, but the Gabriels were also interested in the land. They would end up settling out of court, and the Gabriels would buy the Grubers out of their share and would tear the place down to repurpose the farmland. At the end of February in 1923, the Gabriels would tear down the buildings and in the rubble would find an iron band with dark stains on it. Police would surmise that this was the band used to break poor little Celie's jaw. They would also find the pocket knife that had done the damage to her throat amongst the ruins. As was custom in those days, parts of the building would be reused in other construction, but it seems that they thought by erasing the compound, they could erase the horror. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Despite thorough investigation, no arrest was ever made. No smoking gun to point at anyone. Certainly unsatisfying to say the least. That just leaves us with the common theories. And it's worth noting that the former maid, Christens Rieger, would be interviewed, and although she pointed the finger at a couple of different parties as suspicious or possible, nothing she brought forth shed any more light on what the police already had. The four main theories I want to look at as possible suspects hold a bit more weight. Well, maybe not the first one, but it is a very popular theory that Carl Gabriel, husband of Victoria and father of Celie, didn't die in the war. This idea holds that Carl came back and was not in fact killed in France. Some not so reliable accounts from freed German soldiers describe a Russian captain who let them go, saying wild things about a rural farmstead in Bavaria. So Carl comes back to Hinterkaifeck to see Victoria has had another child, obviously not belonging to him, and flies off the handle. He would know the layout of the house and the area, which would help him sneak in and out, remaining undetected, and the motive is there. However, the unreliability of the returning soldiers and differing reports, and the fact that Carl was presumed dead for 8 years before this happened, leaves me in serious doubt. Also, why would he stick around for a couple of days? The decider on this one leaves it beyond all doubt for me. A member of Hinterkaifeck.net claims to have traveled to France and seen a grave where Carl Gabriel is laid to rest. I definitely do not think it was him. Next up is another very popular idea, and that is that it was actually Andreas himself who committed the heinous deed. This theory looks at what seems to be clear and obvious motive. Remember that little Josef's paternity was still an issue at the time, and if the rumors were true about the nature of Victoria and Andreas' relationship are to be believed, then it stands to reason that Andreas might be upset about Victoria and Lauren's relationship. He could have easily been angry with Lawrence and Victoria, especially if he thought that Josef was Lawrence's child. So, in a fit of rage after he finds out that Victoria gave Lawrence a key to the house, he then attacks the whole family? There was little Celie's story at school about Victoria running off into the night after an argument. The mood at Hinterkaifeck couldn't have been awesome. So maybe Victoria says the wrong thing on March 31st and Andreas blew his lid. The theory explains that he lured the woman to the barn one by one to attack them. Supporters of this idea will point to the fact that Celie was also half-dressed and cite Andreas keeping it in the family with his daughter's sort of tendencies. Knowing that he would not be able to hide what he had done from the maid, he would have taken care of her too. Again, little Josef could have been a source of resentment to Andreas that he thought merited him being removed as well. And this is where this one loses me. How did he smash his own eye with a pickaxe and rip out the side of his own face? In addition, he would have then had to have pulled a door on top of himself. On top of his back, that is. Yeah, he was found face down. All this effort while his face is ripped to shreds doesn't compute for me. Unless, as some believe, that the evil forces that Crescens had believed may be afoot had overcome him and had put the family in some kind of daze, calling to the individuals one by one, possessing Andreas where he could pull the door over himself in that state. Still though, this doesn't explain the maid and Josef. The third suspect is the reason that Lawrence Schlittenbauer would be haunted by that day for the rest of his life. His actions upon discovering the body earned him a great deal of suspicion. His involvement with Victoria and earlier having testified against Andreas provided easy motive. Not to mention the fact that a local teacher would report that on May 4th, 1925, so 2 years after the buildings were destroyed, that he ran into Lawrence at the farmstead. Lawrence was said to be staring down into the foundation of the cellar, which they were unable or didn't bother to destroy. They would obviously strike up a conversation about that night, and Lawrence would say that the killer tried to dig holes to bury the bodies, but was unable to do so because the ground was too frozen. So how did Lawrence know that? Details about the crime scene and the facts of the case that only the perpetrator would know are not things to casually throw about Mr. Schlittenbauer. Of course, we remember that Lawrence moved the bodies as soon as he found them in the barn, and he had a key to the house. His companions that day would say that they were surprised at how fast he had gone into the house, in addition to his shifty behavior. Now, I wanted to bring up the idea of remorse being shown by some killers. The Behavior Analysis Unit of the FBI has attempted to profile this case, and the fact that the bodies were covered is an interesting one. While profiling is obviously not foolproof, why would the killer cover the bodies up with the door in the barn and again with Maria in her room? In addition, whoever it was didn't lift the hood of the bassinet Yosef was in, rather smashed through it. If they knew they were going to stay there for a couple of days, it would make sense to me that they just didn't want to have to look at the faces of their victims during that time. This would usually suggest familiarity as well, which would make sense in Lawrence's case. 1931 would roll around and Lawrence would be interrogated again as the case was reviewed. He would reveal that in 1926, documents detailing Victoria's waiving the child support responsibility, as well as some other files from Hinterkaifeck, were destroyed. Some minor inconsistencies would be found in the second interrogation, but not enough to arrest Lawrence in connection. For me, would Lawrence, who once claimed to want to marry Victoria, really brutally end her? He had already married, so would the pain of Andreas possibly being Yosef's actual father incite all of this? And again, why would Lawrence stay there after the deed was done? He lived very close and would have no reason to stay there after or even before to spy on the family. Literally anyone could have happened by and identified him. The risk of hanging about would have been incredibly high. Although not guilty in the eyes of the law, Lawrence would never escape the court of public opinion. He would be haunted by suspicion and would even go as far to file and win several slander cases against him. His shifty manner on April 4th, 1922, which he maintained was in distress to find his son Yosef, shadowed his reputation for the rest of his days. The fourth and final theory is simple. Most explanations normally are. I do think that this last idea holds the most weight. If we look at the things found in the attic, the hay strewn about, some reports even have it that there was carpet rolled out on the floor to muffle sound. The fact that the mattock was found in the cubby up there, the clear signs of habitation that point to an unknown presence at the farm. Then there's Crescence Rieger, who quit 6 months prior, spouting similar stories about noises in the attic. Andreas himself would even report hearing odd noises up there. Why he never went to the police is beyond me. Could someone have been staying there on and off incognito for months on end? Think about it. How many people frequented that farm, worked on the farm, or lived there at one point or another helping with the chores? Just look at all of the names I have been butchering this whole time, and I haven't even called out all the names that came up in this research. Any one of them could have set up shop in the attic and would have therefore known the place intimately enough to stay there after committing the deed. My theory is that they were either getting worried about being found out or were actually found out. Suppose Victoria was in the stall settling the cows down for the night when she heard something in the barn. Then Cecilia would come out to see where Victoria was, and she too would end up on the haystack. Then would have Andreas and then little Celie. None of them had defensive wounds on them at all, which would indicate a surprise attack on each. If the person had already set up the barn attic to their liking, then this doesn't seem so implausible. The fact that they were covered up also tracks here as well for the same reason. I don't think that they were necessarily intimately close to the Gruber family, perhaps an acquaintance or a passerby who fancied the property. Still, they most likely would not have wanted to look at the victims' faces while still inhabiting the farm. If this person was already comfortable with being at the farm, it might explain why they didn't leave right away. Eventually, though, as more and more people began to show up, they would have had to have cleared off, leaving the families, the neighbors, and the surrounding towns, and all of us with still no clue to this day who committed such a terrible deed at Hinterkaifeck all those years ago. Whew, that was a long one. I always try to remember that while these cases fascinate me, this was an absolute tragedy. And it's always important to have that in mind when reviewing these mysteries. And a mystery it remains. So, please let me know in the comments below if you agree with me that it was a squatter secretly living at the farm for some unknown time, or if it was Lauren Schlittenbauer, or perhaps you have your own theory. I want to hear them all. As also, thank you for watching. Please do not forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me out. I'm really trying to grow my channel, so I appreciate every action that you take. And if you are still here watching, you are my real MVP. Please place a cow emoji in the comment section below so that way I know who you are. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next one.